Attachment. There's Buddhist attachment, and then there's attachment theory, all about how we connect with others and how it shapes our relationships. What do these two ideas have to do with one another?
Hi, it's Margaret Maloney, and welcome to Season 3 of the Death Dhamma podcast. I'm so glad you're here, and I'm so appreciative that you are part of my community. And yet, I seek not to be attached to the idea of the podcast or even to the idea of our community. And that's our topic this season: attachment, clinging, and aversion. What happens when we really want something? What happens when we really don't want something? And what does it do to our suffering and dissatisfaction? Let's dive in and find out a little bit more with today's episode.
If we framed the idea of suffering, our friend, the second noble truth, attachment, clinging, and aversion, if we framed that as reactivity, as in how our minds are reacting to the environment around us, would that help us? And if we understood our attachment style, which is a little bit different and comes, from psychotherapy, would that help us? And can we connect the dots between these two? Are there dots? I'm going to say yes. And for more, welcome to this episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Today, we are speaking with Bill Belanger, and Bill has studied contemplative psychotherapy, and he's a practicing Buddhist. So you can see why he is perfect to spend time with us today. And Bill, that's just like a tiny bit. So please tell us more about yourself.
Sure. Yeah. And thank you so much for having me. So I was trained as a psychotherapist, and then also been a longtime Buddhist practitioner. So primarily in the Tibetan tradition. After graduating college, spent some time traveling throughout Asia, lived and practiced in some monasteries, mostly in Nepal and then Thailand. And then my work now is more coaching and bringing some of this work to make it accessible. So that's really where my passion is, in kind of integrating some of the insights from Western psychology and from Buddhism and making it accessible for Westerners. And my website is integratedmindtraining.com.
So I'm just curious, before we dive into more about emptiness and suffering, the second noble truth, and attachment, what kind of coaching do you do?
I do a lot of coaching with entrepreneurs. So I've kind of always had one foot in the world of entrepreneurship and then the other foot in Buddhism and psychology. Mm-hmm. So that's a lot of the coaching I do is helping entrepreneurs to kind of integrate meditation and therapeutic practices into being better business owners. Mm-hmm. So the view that I take is a lot of people, when they are struggling professionally and their businesses aren't going well, it's oftentimes a reflection of a deeper psychological or emotional issue. So that's a lot of the work that I do.
That's wonderful. And I bet that people, of course, find it really helpful. Now, when we exchanged information and spoke or corresponded a little bit, I know you expressed an interest in delving into emptiness and attachments and how that relates to the second noble truth. And so I want to hear more from you about your thoughts on that.
Yeah. And if it's okay, I thought it might be interesting just to kind of go over the Four Noble Truths in general and contextualize that. So, okay. The way that I think of the Four Noble Truths is it's really a wonderful description of the human condition, mm-hmm. and then a prescription of how to deal with the suffering that's kind of inherent to human life. So the original story of the Buddha is that the Buddha was a prince that lived in a palace, and all of his needs were taken care of and got to indulge in all these sensory pleasures. And then eventually he became restless and left the palace and basically was confronted with reality, seeing that people eventually get sick, they get old, and they die. And so this was deeply disturbing to him and kind of led him on the journey to find a different way. Mm-hmm. So right from the beginning of the story, it's this awareness that indulging in sensory experience is basically a dead-end road. It doesn't lead to lasting satisfaction or happiness. Mm-hmm. And then after his path of meditation and finding his awakening, his first teaching was the Four Noble Truths. So just to go over them, I've heard a lot of different interpretations and translations, but the first truth of dukkha, the translation that I like the most is really that dukkha is reactivity. So it's often translated as suffering, which is another mm-hmm. great way to look at it. But it's more of this habit of the mind of being reactive habitually to our experience. And
Mm-hmm.
then the second truth is that the origin of this suffering, it's craving or attachment, or to go a little bit deeper, it's the three poisons. So it's clinging, it's aversion, and it's ignorance. The fourth truth is that there's a cure, that
Mm-hmm.
you can basically get out of this. And then the fourth is the prescription, which is the Eightfold Path, which is through behavioral changes and contemplative practices, there's a way to kind of ease that suffering and find awakening. So really what the way that I understand this is that these truths are telling us that the mind habitually reacts to the events in its stream of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
It's this reactivity that is kind of the root of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
There's a quote here from one of my past teachers, Dan Brown, that says Buddhism defines everyday unhappiness in terms of a habitual dysfunction in the way that we process our experience. So we basically move towards things that we like,
Mm-hmm.
we push away things that we don't like, or we just are not present at all. And so those are
Right.
kind of
Just
three,
avoid it all. La la la. It's not
avoid it
happening.
all. Exactly. Go into a Netflix coma or something. So
That's
the
such a common
antidote.
diversion. So, sorry.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just
Yeah.
this avoidance of the
Mm-hmm.
intensity of experience and the reactivity of experience. But there's another way that the Buddha teaches, which is basically having a ethical life and practicing meditation, and just moment to moment working with that reactivity of mind is being present with whatever is arising
Mm-hmm.
with no judgment, and just having that continuity of mind essentially. So yeah, it's really this combination of this reactivity and then this other Buddhist teaching of impermanence that kind of chains us to this suffering of life, where
Right.
we're constantly reacting and trying to cling to things, but things are always changing and things basically aren't clingable in the long term.
That's true.
So
I see why that definition of suffering is really helpful. And I appreciate it because, as you say it, it makes so much sense to me. I don't know that I've ever really thought of it exactly in that way, but because it is really what we do with our minds, it's how we process things. And so that clinging and that aversion and those three poisons are all about how we perceive things and how we either build upon them or, like you said, reject them. And so I really appreciate that. And you're right. Not everyone, but there are many different ways to express the truth of suffering. And that is a really helpful one, because I think if we look at it combined with the teachings are really about what can we do within ourselves.
yes. Yeah, which is, and it's a fundamentally different approach to dealing with suffering than we think of it in Western modern terms. So,
Mm-hmm.
the way that I think of this as well is that we have all these other available prescriptions in the West now to deal with suffering, and most of them don't work that well, unfortunately.
That's
So
fair to say.
now,
Sure.
yeah, it's either consumerism, that's what will help you get rid of your suffering or this reactivity. So maybe you feel uncomfortable about your body. Well, if you get really fit, or if you have the new clothes, or if you have the best makeup, that will deal with it. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
go that deep. Consumerism or even dogma and rigid ideology. There are all these answers that we're all trying to cling to kind of deal with that base level of reactivity. But using the Buddha's analysis, none of them really work in a lasting way.
That's
So
true.
again, I do think that this analysis just goes very deep at this existential core of what it is to be a human,
Mm-hmm.
and has like a very coherent and elegant solution to it that a lot of other things in the West just don't come close to, in my opinion.
And if you look at it in his way, in his time, the Buddha knew, because he had his version of, consumerism, capitalism things, because that's what he grew up with as a prince in a palace where everything was at his beck and call. And then when he first went off on his own, before he sat under the tree and became enlightened, he did do that extreme, asceticism. And you could say that that was absolutely a form of dogma, where his teachers, so to speak, were eventually, when he left that and found the middle way, they were saying, oh, he's wrong and he's fallen. But he tried those extremes that you're mentioning.
Definitely, and I think that's often a part that we don't talk about as much, that I like, that he went out and experimented, and he worked with different teachers, he tried different methods, and that's where a lot of his wisdom came from.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, ultimately these extreme approaches just don't really work. They don't deal with that, again, as Dan Brown calls it, that habitual dysfunction of the ordinary
Mm-hmm.
mind. So some of those practices tend to be reenactment of this dysfunction. You're becoming more extreme. So you could go one end of the spectrum of the asceticism, or now, which we do more in the West, is this indulgence and sensory experience.
Right. So why do you think we still grapple with this? I mean, obviously, if it were easy, everyone would be enlightened. So we know it's not easy, but yet it has been so long since he taught us, and other teachers have been on the planet and maybe taught a similar kind of thing in a different way. So why is this still happening to us?
It's interesting. I think that's a deep question. I mean, I think it's on an individual level and like a social, cultural level.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, I think it's just the nature of what it is to be a human. It just seems so hardwired into our physiology. So one of the things has been interesting for me, I mentioned before we started recording that I have a newborn.
Mm-hmm.
So being with him, it's been this interesting teaching on this reactivity and the suffering, and I'm already kind of thinking about it a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm.
But again, this idea that we're reactive to the events that happen in our lives, and we try to move towards what we like and move away from what we don't like. For my newborn infant, that's a perfectly appropriate response. That's exactly what he should be doing, right? So that this fussiness of his diaper is wet, or he's hungry, or he's too cold, or he's too warm, that's letting us know that he needs attention and is basically helping him to live. If he didn't have that deep level reactivity, he'd be in big trouble pretty quickly. So I think the way that I'm looking at it now is that this is just part of being a human. It's probably just part of being a mammal in general, just any animal, that it's really it's a survival level instinct first.
Okay.
And we're not really hardwired to just be content and happy all the time, because that's not going to encourage us to go, take care of our needs or mate or get food. It's more of this dissatisfaction kind of drives our experience, our behavior rather. So I think it's just a deeply hardwired thing. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it is a privilege and a luxury when you can live in a time and a place where you have the ability to look at your mind and work with your mind and be curious about it. Because I think for most people, they never get to that. It's so much on the survival level living. And
Mm-hmm.
even in the West too, just of being stressed out and burned out and focus on the next thing.
Yep, that makes sense. It's almost evolutionary.
Yeah.
And as you describe it, like that is part of evolution, because like you talk about like the need to get food and the need to continue the species. And it's right, that does come from a level of dissatisfaction, right? Oh, I need to do this. Oh, I want to do that. I mean, it drives us. And then, obviously we're not trying to put ourselves into extinction, except for we are, because if we all became enlightened and moved on, we would be, I'll say, a different species, perhaps, or a different way of being, right?
Yeah, and I think to me it's where I think the West does really well with developmental psychology is understanding, the development from an infant to an adult. So
Mm-hmm.
I do think infants have access to probably some awareness that's beyond time and using some of the Mahayana teachings, Buddha nature in some way, but
Mm-hmm.
they're not a fully developed adult yet. So I think if a child had no preference at all between what he was experiencing, he couldn't survive because he's not going to get fed, he's not going to get his diaper changed, he's not going to keep warm.
Right.
But I think as an adult, it's more the prefrontal cortex comes online. You can still know, hey, I'm hungry, I need to eat. But there's this other mindfulness or witnessing awareness that is non-reactive and can kind of be a little bit more present with it. So it really is, it's more, in my perspective, it's like an evolution, really,
Mm-hmm.
where of human consciousness, where you're still keeping that other part of yourself that is still driving. There's still always that unsatisfactoriness, which I think we need on some level. But
Sure.
there's another part that can be present and non-reactive. So you're not getting rid of that reactivity because again, we need to know when we're hungry or cold or in pain.
Yes. Yes. It's what some of my teachers have remind me is it comes back to being skillful. It's not
Skillful.
that you're never going to want breakfast. It's being skillful about that. It's not that
Yeah.
you're never going to want to be comfortable when it's hot or, stay away from flooding and storms. It's how we do it and how we
Yeah.
come to it and crave to it and act about it, right?
Definitely,
Yeah.
definitely.
Hmm.
Yeah, and this comes to there's a few different ways we could take this conversation. But maybe we could talk a little bit about attachment theory in the
Yeah.
West, which I know we had spoken about, which I think is kind of an interesting topic, very different than the Four Noble Truths, but
Hmm.
I see some parallels that I think are pretty interesting.
I would love to hear
Um,
those.
yeah, so in Western psychotherapy, there's this idea of attachment or attachment theory.
Hmm.
Now, especially for the Buddhist listeners, attachment is a loaded word. So we need to preface that attachment in this context doesn't mean attachment in the Buddhist context.
Right.
Attachment is more how infants attach to their caregivers.
Hmm.
So for the purpose of today, we could even say a better word is connection. That's really what it's about. It's how to
How we
infants
connect with others.
exactly. How do we
Okay.
connect with others? And it's rooted in how infants connect with their caregivers, but traditionally it's called attachment.
Hmm.
Um, so basically, attachment is formed early in life. I think it's really mostly around like that first year to 2 years is when it's strongest formed. And infants have to learn if their caregivers are secure and if they can feel safety or if they're insecure. So
Okay.
again, it's this it comes from evolution, and it's the baby has to adapt to its circumstances. So there's four main types of attachment style. So the first is secure. So an
Hmm.
infant is attached securely. They feel safe with the infant or with the mother or their father, rather. Um, the second is anxious or
Okay.
preoccupied when they get really stressed and they try to cling to the mother or the father.
Hmm.
Um, the third is avoidant, where they avoid that connection.
Hmm.
And then the fourth is disorganized, which is more of like a pretty serious psychopathology. And so one of the classic studies where they would look at these is they would have a mother with their child, and
Hmm.
then the mother would leave the room, and the child would be with the researcher. So a securely attached child feels safe when the mother leaves because he or she trusts that the mother will come back. So
Okay.
they'll play with toys, they feel safe. When the mother comes back, they're delighted.
Hmm.
An anxious child, an anxious or preoccupied attachment style, when the mother leaves, the child gets extremely upset and is crying and can't be consoled. So they don't trust that the mother's going to come back and they don't feel safe. And
Hmm.
then when the mother comes back, they're very clingy and they won't let go. So it's this
Okay.
inability to kind of have some autonomy and play without that caregiver there.
Hmm.
Um, and the avoidant style is that the child has learned to kind of avoid the connection altogether. The mother leaves and the mother comes back, the child acts as if nothing happened, totally ignores the mother. It's pretending the child pretends he or she is totally autonomous.
Okay.
Um, and disorganized is kind of like an incoherent mix of both of these strategies.
Hmm.
So it's pretty fascinating because there's a lot of research on this, but depending on the attachment style that a child has, it deeply impacts all types of mental health issues later in life.
Right.
So people who go through PTSD, for example, if they have secure attachment, they're much more likely to recover than somebody who has an insecure attachment. People with
Oh.
insecure attachment styles are much more likely to have personality disorders and all other types of issues. So it's kind of like this root of our psyche is formed really early in our lives. And again, it's what I find so fascinating and how this kind of relates to this similar Buddhist insight. It's again, how do we relate to our experience, and
Hmm.
what is a healthy and an unhealthy way to relate to experience? So that healthy way is staying in connection, right?
Okay.
Being present with what's there.
Hmm.
Or the other strategies, you're either move towards something and try to make more of it, which is the anxious clinging style, or
Right.
push away and try to avoid, which is more of that avoidance style. So whereas the Buddhists really talk about this often in terms of, a meditation practice and working with one's own mind,
Hmm.
in attachment theory, it's a little bit more relational. It's
Okay.
how do we
Can
relate to different things?
I want to jump in and ask a quick question. Can I change or am I a thing for life? So like if I have anxious style as a baby, am I going to be that way forever or can I change?
You can definitely change. And now what's interesting is mindfulness is used a lot in attachment interventions. It's like a
Hmm.
really big part of it, and I think it's helped that field. So we call it earned secure attachment. So there might be, if you have one of these other styles, and
Hmm.
through therapy and again practices like mindfulness, or having a healthy, intimate relationship as an adult can be very healing for people with attachment issues. You can basically develop a new way, new pathways. Yeah, and there's a whole other that I could go down a whole long tangent about the
Okay.
different process of that, but essentially it's not fixed in stone, and
Okay.
there it can be healed. And it's learning to have this healthy connection again.
Right. And so whatever I come from, whatever I'm working with, it is about finding a way to create, like you're saying, a healthy way of connection. And I
Yes.
think you are starting to go down the path of how some aspects of Buddhism can maybe help me with that. Is that where we're going?
Yeah, there's a few different ways we can go. I mean, one is this mindfulness, but it's relating to our experience. So on the individual level, just to state this, psychology theory is, it's easy to say you either have one of these styles or you don't. It's never
Right.
that simple. We
Okay.
all have a mix of these. So
Okay.
we each usually have one style that we gravitate towards when times are tough or we're triggered. So
Hmm.
for me, I'd say I'm mostly secure, but when I'm having a hard time, that anxious, preoccupied style, that's the stuff I have to work with. So I'm more anxiety prone. I have to really work with that.
Hmm.
So if I'm using mindfulness, rather than being reactive and I'm anxious and I have to call my wife or I feel uncomfortable or it can come up in a work setting. This person didn't get back to me. I have to kind of keep calling them. Mindfulness has allowed me to just be more present with those difficult feelings. Oh, I'm noticing I'm really anxious
Hmm.
and I'm noticing I'm really uptight. Let's just take a few minutes and breathe. And these feelings aren't going to kill me. I can be present with it. And
I see.
then I learn that tolerance over time.
I see. Now, is it possible? Because I appreciate that you're saying like it's not, even though we're talking about here are the attachment styles, it's not that cut and dried, and we can exhibit more than one. So, is it possible that in different relationships, I might be different ways based on my perception of the value of the relationship or something like that?
Definitely. If you really want to get Buddhist about it too, which I think is an interesting thought experiment, it's more your attachment style is moment to moment. So it's
Hmm.
just in this moment, what is your attachment style to another person that you're talking with? So again, that's where I think the Buddhist understanding starts to deconstruct the Western understanding a little bit, that they're not these rigid categories. Using Buddhist language are actually empty, that it's these categories help us to understand, but they're not as solid as we think. So
Okay.
we all have a mix. And usually in therapy, it's the place that these most get acted out is intimate relationships. So if
Hmm.
with your
Yeah.
partner, that's usually where hopefully we can find a healthy, secure relationship. But we all have some of the stuff that comes up during our relationships.
Okay, that makes sense. And I will just interject that I have known a couple of people, socially, that have studied this on their own, and I want to point that out, but without the help of a seasoned therapist. And so they have on their own come to a decision about what they are and what other people are, and they could be correct, because there's, I think, a lot of material you can find out there if you want to, but I recommend that you work with someone, and that they very much we're coming from the place of I can't change. I can only be this thing. And so it's always going to be this way. And then analyzing other people in a social situation and saying like, well, she's this and he's that. And I guess, I'm happy to hear you talk about this more in depth, because I've always questioned the value of that.
Yeah,
Value of
I
me saying
agree.
like, I can't help it. I'm this way and this is how I am.
Well, I think again, using a Buddhist analysis of that, we get really attached to our conceptualizations about things,
Mm-hmm.
and then that can cause us to suffer. Right. So it's I mean, even from a therapy perspective, it's just not accurate, because people can get healed from this. And I actually don't think it's that hard anymore. It takes work, but it's
Mm-hmm.
definitely, there's a lot of good interventions. The field has improved a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but again, I think it's less that I am this way, because again, from a Buddhist perspective, they'd ask, well, who is the self and who
Right.
is this other person? So right off the bat, the conceptualization is a little bit mistaken. So I think
Mm-hmm.
that bringing a little bit of Buddhism into the attachment theory, it's just about connection moment to moment. Or am I being present with what's in front of me,
Mm-hmm.
or am I somehow avoiding it? Whether that's avoiding my experience rather by trying to grasp onto something and make it different, or push it away, essentially.
Yeah, this makes sense. So when you're, let's say you're
working with someone, let's say you're coaching someone and that this is something that you might be working on together.
Yeah.
And you're introducing maybe these Buddhist concepts to somebody who doesn't come from Buddhism. Do you find a resistance, like when we talk about that, like, well, let's identify who is this self that's, stuck in this belief that I always have to be this way. How do you find the introduction of the Buddhist concepts to work out with people?
Yeah, for me personally, I'm not on a mission to convert anybody. If they're interested in Buddhist language, great. If not, no worries. I try to just bring it to the direct experience in the moment. I think that's the best way to do it. And yeah, it's just what's arising in the moment, and how can we kind of be kind to that. So it's interesting because psychology focuses on attachment, usually in terms of relational terms. But I think you can also apply that to attachment to one's own experience, even using the breath. Is the breath healthy attachment figure or not? So a lot of these early childhood things get acted out even in somebody's individual meditation practice, which I think is really interesting. But yeah, I think it's just, I think for me it's just intuitively where's somebody at, and what language is going to be helpful to them ultimately.
And I know something we mentioned when we were corresponding before we started speaking was a little bit about emptiness fitting into some of this, and so I wanted to hear your thoughts around that.
Definitely. I realized I was getting ready for this, that emptiness is one of the most difficult topics in Buddhism to discuss. So
yes, it is, but we're going to try it anyway, because that's how we are.
So we'll try. So if you don't mind, I have a passage from Thich Nhat Hanh, which I think is really beautiful. So again, we have to be really careful of these terms, and I think look at them critically, because emptiness, if you say that to somebody in the West who doesn't know anything about Buddhism, it sounds negative.
Yes,
so
it does. Yes, it does.
It's empty. It sounds nihilistic, but that's not what it means. So this book that I'm going to read a quote from is The Heart of Understanding, which is commentaries on the Prajnaparamita Heart Sutra from Thich Nhat Hanh. So he has a really beautiful description that I'll read here. So it's called interbeing. So this is in the book, so he's talking about the book. If you are a poet, you will see clearly that there's a cloud floating in the sheet of paper. Without a cloud, there will be no rain. Without rain, the trees cannot grow. And without trees, we cannot make paper. The cloud is essential for the paper to exist. If the cloud is not here, the sheet of paper cannot be here either. So we can say that the cloud and the paper inter-are. Interbeing is a word that is not in the dictionary yet, but if we combine the prefix inter with the verb to be, we have a new verb, interbe. Without a cloud, we cannot have a paper, so we can say that the cloud and the sheet of paper inter-are. If we look into the sheet of paper even more deeply, we can see the sunshine in it. If the sunshine is not there, the forest cannot grow. In fact, nothing can grow. Even we cannot grow without sunshine. And so we know that the sunshine is also in the sheet of paper. The paper and the sunshine inter-are. And if we continue to look, we can see the logger who cut down the tree and brought it to the mill to be transformed into paper. And we can also see the wheat. We know that the logger cannot exist without his daily bread, and therefore the wheat that became his bread is also in the sheet of paper. And the logger's father and mother are in it too. When we look in this way, we can see without all these things, a sheet of paper cannot exist. So the passage goes on, and you continue to analyze it, that there's actually nothing that is not present in that sheet of paper. So it's that everything is somehow interconnected and interdependent on each other. So this idea of emptiness is that the way that we construct reality, it's a construction of the mind. So the reality that we see and experience it's a construction of both our nervous system and then our logical minds. So we like to cut things up and get really rigid and attached to them. But even just with a logical analysis, it's not really true. It's just not how things are. So the way that I conceptualize of it is that there's that logical component where we have a lot of ideas about reality that we get attached to, that we cling to, that cause suffering. And then from this, even a nervous system level, when we're looking around in the outside world, we think that we're perceiving the outside world, but we're not. We're really kind of perceiving the brain's construction of the outside world. So it's something like, in terms of the electromagnetic field, for example, we can only see 1% of what's in front of us, which is visible light. So there's this whole world of information and energy and light and smells and all these different things, but we make a really rudimentary representation of that with our minds. but we take it really seriously and we hold it really tightly. So even just, for people that have a dog in their house, the dog could be in the same room, but it's smelling all types of things that a human can't smell. Its construction of the room is dramatically different. But again, when we forget this, it's another reason that we suffer and we cling. So I'll pause there, but yeah.
Yes, that is beautiful. So I will say simple, but not simple, right? Like when you break it down and you go through each step, I feel like each step becomes clear and simple. But walking around in life, I think we're not always trained to think in that way, from the paper, the cloud on the paper to the tree to, everything, the rain to everything that was needed. What I'm thinking about is there a way for me to use that concept and that way of thinking of emptiness and interbeing to help me manage, I'll say, unskillful attachment?
Yeah, I think there is. There's a few different ways. And the tradition that I was trained in with this is the Mahamudra tradition in Tibetan Buddhism. And so they'll do emptiness meditation. So it's basically, they'll have different stages for it, but it's usually the way that I was trained. It's there, you'll basically deconstruct the sense of self, you'll deconstruct external reality, and then even the sense of time. And that sounds really intense, but it's more that you're just looking directly to the experience and trying to see if it's solid or not. So for example, if somebody is feeling really fearful about something, if you really just look and ask yourself, who is the person that's feeling fearful? And in meditation, you search for that person, you'll find pretty quickly that there's really nothing solid there. It's just a movement of energy. And if you say, oh, I think I found my sense of self, look into it deeper and keep breaking it down into its component parts. And it's not, there's really nothing to be found. And then you can do that again in terms of an emotion. If there's something that's clinging or attachment, we assume that these things are solid, or these emotions are really solid, but they're not. It's these constantly moving energy. So I think part of it is this remembering the logic, and then part of it's just this invitation to examine our experience a little bit more when we're clinging to something or we're having that experience.
So as you're saying that, what's coming to light for me is that in a situation where I might be clinging or having aversion towards something, there's a part where I can also be looking at, well, who is this Margaret that's doing this? And then I think there's another piece, which is I can also deconstruct whatever this thing is, that I really want or really don't want. And as I start pulling out and identifying all the different pieces that make up this thing, what constructs it, then I'm faced with, well, what part is it I'm really grabbing onto, or what part is it I'm really pushing away?
Yeah, and it's just this idea that we're superimposing these ideas and these mental constructs onto reality all the time, and then we get attached to those constructs, and that they make us suffer. So there's a Greek story I liked, where they talked about a really old ship, and it was so old that it had a name for the ship, and every year they had to keep replacing boards and nails, and it got to the point a couple hundred years later there wasn't a single nail or piece of wood on the ship from the original, but we still call it the same ship. So it's kind of this thought experiment: is it the same ship or not? But it's the same with the human body, right? With this changing of cells. So my name is Bill. My name was Bill Belanger when I was 2. When I was a teenager, in my 30s, it's all the same. And even when I pass away, if someone talks about me, it's the same construct. But there's actually nothing constant. It's this changing physically, this changing of thoughts, this changing of emotions. So it's just this other way. It's a different strategy for working with clinging. It's kind of investigating that a little bit more.
Yes, because everything has changed. All our cells have turned over. They're doing it now while we're talking to each other. Yeah, it's true. It's true. Very good. It's very good. I want to make sure that we get to, cover the things that you really wanted to bring today. And so I wanted to check in with you and see, what else would you like to share? What else would you like for everyone to know about?
Yeah, I think maybe just another interesting thing we could chat about a little bit, but is this another way of kind of dealing with this reactivity of mind, which is in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, there's these two main schools of philosophy, the Madhyamaka, which is the middle way school, and the Yogacara, which is the mind-only school. So that Yogacara emphasizes Buddha nature, which is a little bit different than emptiness. So I find those practices to be very interesting. And that perspective is more in terms of working with reactivity. It's again, it doesn't try to change the reactivity. It's more pointing out that there's a level of awareness that is already non-reactive all the time. So it's a slightly different approach where we're not trying to even get rid of the reactivity, because they would argue that the reactivity is just an expression of Buddha nature as well.
Okay.
So it's a different, interesting way of doing it, where you're opening up this level of awareness that is always here. It's present. It's this Buddha nature, and essentially everything is an expression of that. So that gets to be really interesting, because then even painful experiences, difficult emotions, or craving, or attachment, or aversion, from that perspective, are expressions of this Buddha nature. So the practice in that school is more, what they'll say is holding that view. It's opening up to that and resting in that. And then whatever arises, you're seeing it as an expression of that Buddha nature. So it's a pretty interesting way to work with it.
So if I'm accepting of whatever is happening, to do that is to acknowledge that whatever is happening, and it is part of my Buddha nature. And therefore, and I know I'm really oversimplifying. And so therefore, it's an important part of my practice and of my moving forward on the path, because my Buddha nature is there. And so therefore, nothing happens to me that isn't part of awakening my Buddha nature.
Yeah, exactly. So there'll even be in Mahamudra, there's teaching that's saying taking the obstacle as the path. So that can both be when negative things are happening in your life. Oh, this actually is the path. But it's also moment to moment in meditation practice, when you're getting distracted, or you're not paying attention, or you're feeling pain in your knees when you're sitting for a long time. It's taking the view that those are actually helping you to be present. That it's an expression of that Buddha nature. So it's just this. It's kind of like a very large vantage point of this awareness that's beyond the self, resting in that, and then whatever happens in the self happens in the self. So it's not this. We're not fighting against our experience at all. It's just It's like a total acceptance.
We're accepting what is happening, which really is a great way of not having aversion.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And now, they take it pretty. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to ask, did you want to tell us more about the Yogacara perspective?
Yeah, and this is where I probably start to get very underqualified. But this Yogacara sometimes is associated with this mind-only view of reality, which is really interesting. And it's this idea that whatever we're seeing is in front of us is a construction of mind. So there's specific meditations with that. But one of the things is just a mantra people will say when you're walking around, reminding yourself, mind only, mind only, mind only. From a modern perspective, it is more, listeners can even do this now, of looking around their room and realizing what I'm seeing is a construction of the mind. This is my nervous system, and my awareness is making this mental representation of reality. And what I'm looking at is an expression of mind. I'm not looking at objective reality. So coming back to the Thich Nhat Hanh commentary, he talks about how that the piece of paper is also dependent on mind. So without that mind, or without awareness, there's none of it. So that school emphasizes that perspective a little bit more. There's other teachings where they'll talk about illusory experience. So it's reminding yourself that everything you're seeing is like a dream, essentially.
Okay.
But again, it's not fundamentally solid in the way that we think. Mm-hmm. It's just this representation of the mind. So it's an interesting perspective to take. I think especially when we're really triggered or wrapped up in something, it kind of helps us to kind of zoom out and try to see the bigger picture, and maybe even laugh about it. That this is just this construction of mind. It's like a dream. It's not real. It's just our representation of things.
There you go. Thank you. I think that is a really useful way to express that, because we won't dive into it, but and I am, I'll say, less skilled at communicating about Yogacara, but I will say that there's those that will say, but when you're saying I've constructed this by my mind and you're being attacked by a grizzly bear, shouldn't you do something about it? And the answer is yes, of course you should.
But I like what you said, because I think what it helps with is that reminder that how I'm acting, perceiving, feeling things are because of how I am processing things. Or once upon a time, I was going through something very difficult, and I had this aunt whom I adored. And she said this thing to me one day, which initially really made me mad, which, means it was true. And she said,
Yeah.
remember, you're not in your right mind right now.
Mm.
Because you're upset, the way you're perceiving things might not be accurate. And of course, I was annoyed, but of course, she was right. So I feel like that's part of what you're giving to us when you're saying, remember, this is coming from my mind.
Yeah, definitely. It's from Western terms, it's metacognitive awareness. It's being awareness of your own state. And so that's really helpful. And I'll do that too in business sometimes, where if I'm doing something and I know, oh man, I just got really angry, even if it feels really true and I feel really wrapped up in it, I know enough to say, just sleep on it and we'll see how I feel in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I'm in that angry state of mind, the decisions are going to be bad. My communication is going to be bad. It's just everything is tainted by that. Mm-hmm. So I think that this yogacara perspective goes even further than that, which is like, well, when we're in this dualistic state of mind, generally we're just fundamentally deluded. Right. So it's more of like just even reminding ourselves of that. But even noticing that, it starts to shift our awareness a little bit. So it's I think it can be really powerful practice.
And practice and practical, right? Hence practice, because it is very practical to understand right now I might be delusional, and that means that maybe this isn't the best time for me to make a decision or react to something. And by the way, I really don't have to. And I do think that's a challenge we have in the Western world, is we are trained sometimes that we have to respond to something right away. Like if somebody says something to you, you have to say something back right away, or you have to act right away because somebody's jumping up and down in front of you saying, Bill, you have to do this now. But the truth is, most of the time, it's not a real grizzly bear. And no, you don't.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a Buddhist therapist I worked with who I really liked, but he would invite clients when they're having a difficult experience to really stay embodied in the present moment and feel it in the body, and ask yourself, is there any evidence that this is hurting me? Mm-hmm. So it's usually I'm so triggered because I didn't get a promotion at work, or my boyfriend broke up with me, or whatever it is. And then we have this physiological response to your point. It's as if a bear is attacking us, but we're in an air-conditioned room. We're totally safe. There's nothing wrong physically. So yeah, it is just that bringing that awareness of not getting too caught up in it and kind of seeing it as for what it is.
I would love to hear from you, your thoughts, your suggestions, your own stories about attachment. So follow this link, I'm going to read it to you in a minute here, to leave me a 90-second message with your ideas and suggestions. You can go to https://www.speakpipe.com/death_Dhamma_podcast. I suppose you could also just use your favorite search engine to say SpeakPipe Death Dhamma Podcast. And there you can record an audio message for me. And be sure to come over to margaretmeloni.com. That's MargaretMeloni.com and join the community. You've been listening to the Death Dhamma Podcast with your host, Margaret Meloni. Thank you so much for being here. Come find me on margaretmeloni.com, MargaretMeloni.com. And until we meet again, may you be well, may you be happy, may you be at ease, and may you be free from suffering. Bye for now.